On July 8, 2003, an employee at Little Caesars Pizza in SabJoe, California, USA, received the most unusual call of their life. A little girl, her voice quivering as if she was scared and crying, spelled out each letter of her address for the pizza delivery. Although it seemed odd, the employee thought perhaps the girl was just upset from being scolded by her parents. Little did they know, on the other end of the line was a 9-year-old girl who had recently been kidnapped and was living through some of the most horrifying moments imaginable. The girl was Jeannette Tamayo, a 9-year-old kidnapped and enduring the worst days of her life. Known among her schoolmates as a detective aficionado, a solitary friend, and an eccentric, Jeannette had a passion for crime investigations. She had watched every crime investigation broadcast in the United States, whether on TV or online. This passion, perhaps, serendipitously equipped her to do something extraordinary that few other 9-year-olds could manage. Jeannette, who lost her father early, lived with her mother and older brother, Paul, in California. Life went on as usual until the afternoon of June 7, 2003, when her life and her family's took a dark, fearful turn. Returning home from school that day, Jeannette felt an unusual air about the house. It was odd because her mother would still be at work and her brother at school, yet the door was ajar by 7 to 8 centimeters, suggesting someone had entered. Assuming her mother might have returned early for some chores, Jeannette entered the house without suspicion. However, she was unaware of the danger lurking inside. Upon entering her room, Jeannette was shocked to find her window shattered. Realizing something was terribly wrong, she rushed to the living room, picked up the phone to call her mother, only to find the line cut. Panic-stricken and feeling cornered like a frightened animal, Jeannette, with her extensive exposure to detective movies, understood the grim scenario unfolding. It meant she and the perpetrator were alone in the house. Before she could think of what to do next, she saw a shadow move behind the curtain. Asking if it was her brother Paul, she was instead confronted by a middle-aged man emerging from behind the curtain, smiling sinisterly at her. The man calmly said, "I've missed you, Jeannette," leaving her confused and unable to recall ever meeting him. Before she could react, the stranger changed his demeanor and lunged at her, grabbing her hair and dragging her into the bedroom. What followed was 2 hours of relentless assault with bizarre tools, leaving Jeannette, a minor, completely drained of strength, unable to even stand. Just when it seemed over, the perpetrator decided not to release Jeannette and kidnapped her instead. Calmly dressing her and tying her legs together, he carried her to his car parked in the garage. The criminal had carefully planned, considering the family's routine. However, he didn't anticipate that at that moment, Jeannette's brother Paul would come home early, picked up by their mother. As he struggled with the garage door, only managing to open it partially, another car pulled up. From the back seat, Jeannette recognized it was her mother's car. Her mother, overwhelmed with worry, ran into the house. Paul, sensing something wrong in the garage area, decided to stay behind. Jumping out of the car and squeezing through the partially open garage door, Jeannette frantically told Paul to run. But how had the malevolent figure already positioned himself so close to the door? He seized Paul, a 15-year-old boy who was no match for the burly and towering assailant. Despite realizing his inability to overpower the dangerously strange man, Paul still did his utmost to fight and protect his younger sister. In a rush, Paul grabbed a screwdriver and lunged at the man. However, as expected, the criminal quickly disarmed Paul, delivering continuous punches to the boy's face before dragging him into the room. When he dragged Paul into the kitchen, they encountered Jeannette's mother there. Using all her strength, she managed to pull her son away from the clutches of the strange man. Subsequently, Paul rushed to the kitchen cabinet, seized a frying pan, and advanced towards the assailant. Yet once more, the improvised weapon was wrested from Paul's grip. The man then used the pan to strike Jeannette's mother repeatedly, until she screamed loudly and fell to the ground. In the end, the savage attacker hurried back to the garage. Despite being exhausted, in pain, and depleted, when Jeannette saw the blood on the face of the wicked man, she couldn't help but blurt out, "Have you killed my mother and brother?" His response was a cryptic smile, laden with hidden meanings. The attacker started the car and accelerated like a madman. Jeannette could only glance back at her home, slowly receding into the distance. She felt an immense relief seeing her mother running out of the house and frantically following. This meant her mother was still alive, despite the blood on her face. From afar, Paul was also limping, waving his hands, and shouting for help. A question that puzzles many is how we always live with the existence of our neighbors. It's hard to imagine that during the loud struggle against the attack on Jeannette's mother and brother, not a single person nearby could hear and come to their aid. Even when Jeannette was being assaulted for 2 hours, her screams of agony went unheard. Didn't any neighbor see or step forward to help or bear witness? Indeed, there was. Ironically, the witness was the neighbor boy, whom Jeannette had a crush on. He had recorded the scene of her being sexually assaulted by the criminal. With the video evidence, the perpetrator should have been apprehended by now. But it's a pity that the boyfriend didn't give the video to the police. Because you didn't film to track down the perpetrator. What's the real reason behind that? At the end of the day, no one can explain it. Back to the little Jeannette. As soon as the car ran to a curve, Jeannette started screaming loudly at the cars that were passing through her, shouldering her shoulders at the window to attract attention and help from somebody else. But it's all useless. On the contrary, the bad guy came back with a screw turret and attacked her brutally, causing her to fall. 9-year-old Jeannette must have been very painful and frightened, very desperate to see her mother and her brother beaten down while she had become the possession of some bad guy. Jeannette continues to dream, but then she must surely wake up to accept the other horrors of this evil kidnapper, as a long and painful journey of endless pain. The narrative of a girl who was kidnapped and raped when she was only 9 became an obsession with all her relatives and the police involved. In that strange car, Jeannette is desperate and realizes she won't be able to live any longer. But, is there a miracle? Or if the police can find this poor little girl? The criminal, after a 30-minute drive to the garage of a white housewife in a strange area. After parking the car, he dragged Jeannette into the house, up the stairs, and stopped at a room furnished with an old TV, a small window, a bed, and a bathroom, before locking Jeannette inside. Naturally, he didn't leave the girl in peace. After nearly torturing Jeannette for an hour, he tied her hands to the shower head and turned on the water, leaving her there for a while. The police were scrambling for clues and evidence in desperation. While Jeannette was taken to her attacker's home and subjected to terrifying ordeals, the police began their investigation. At that time, the detective in charge of Jeannette's case was Heather, a skilled police detective from California. Despite being a woman, she was a competent officer handling serious cases. Upon arriving at the scene, Heather collected blood samples throughout the house and began an investigation with police dogs and handlers. Unfortunately, they searched the house but found no trace of the murderer's blood. Not even bodily fluids that could have been present during the criminal's assault on Jeannette were found. He was meticulous in covering his tracks. Additionally, Jeannette lived in the Harlem area, so there were very few homes equipped with surveillance cameras. The police found a small security camera installed in the home of Jeannette's neighbor. The CCTV footage showed a burglar breaking into Jeannette's home, with her mother and brother screaming for help. However, as you can see, the image quality was so poor that they couldn't identify the face of the kidnapper. In the end, the police were only sure of one thing: the criminal had carefully planned his crime. He knew Jeannette would be the first to come home and knew when Jeannette's mother would be home. He even knew the location of the girl's room, so he entered through the window of Jeannette's room, which was farthest from the front door of the house. And since the attacker wore gloves and a mask, it was almost a perfect plan. Detective Heather, in charge of the case at the time, concluded that there was only one thing she could do: disseminate information about Jeannette by any means necessary. Heather immediately organized a press conference to inform reporters about Jeannette. This information was broadcasted hourly across all local state agencies. "Jeannette, if you're alive, we're looking for you, so don't give up." The family also began searching for Jeannette through a series of public talks. Heather's rationale for this approach was simple. With the perpetrator leaving no trace, it was more crucial to send a message to the perpetrator than to find him, to create psychological pressure. Flyers began to be distributed in every corner of the town. Naturally, Jeannette, captured by the attacker, heard this broadcast daily. Jeannette regained hope and began to plan her escape. Jeannette, bullied daily and bleeding between her legs each day. thought she needed to talk to her captor to gain his trust. On the 5th day after being kidnapped, Jeannette, still harassed by the attacker as usual, spoke to the attacker with the brightest smile she could muster. "Where are you from?" Then, the attacker looked at Jeannette with a suspicious expression. Jeannette looked at the captor and smiled, trying to appear as innocent as possible. "Please, may I have a glass of water?" For the first time, the captor smiled, then left Jeannette to get water. At that moment, Jeannette started thinking about the detective series she watched every day. She began considering the clues detectives usually look for. Quickly, she grabbed the captor's watch and picked up some red toys scattered around the room. Then, she ran into the bathroom and took toilet paper to apply her body fluids on those objects. This act was that of a 9-year-old girl wanting her captor to be punished, even at the risk of her own life. She then returned to sit on the bed, casually scattering the collected evidence in a corner to disguise it as mere trash. Soon after, the captor brought her water. There was only one thought in Jeannette's mind. "Please, don't touch me." She trembled more than usual but tried to control it to avoid detection, understanding that too much trembling would arouse suspicion. 10 days had passed since Jeannette's disappearance. By this point, she had become numb to the torment inflicted by her captor. Her focus was solely on escaping, and her actions over the past 10 days had gradually built a semblance of trust with him. Finally, it seemed to have an effect. After assaulting her less aggressively than usual, the captor asked Jeannette, "Are you hungry?" Jeannette nodded. He gave her his address and instructed her to order a pizza using his mobile phone. Soon after, the pizza was delivered. The man took it and placed it in front of Jeannette, smiling because the pizza box had a missing person flyer with Jeannette's face on it. "Enjoy your meal, for after you've finished, you will die." He then left the room. Jeannette ate a few slices to gather strength and placed all the evidence she had into the pizza box. She then hid it under the bed, thinking, "Even if I die, you will surely be caught." A few hours later, as dawn broke, the man entered the room where Jeannette was sleeping and began to wash her, removing any remaining traces of his fluids on her body. He then placed a terrifying weapon in front of Jeannette and pondered it for a long time. Jeannette could only tremble. After a moment, he surprisingly tied Jeannette up with a rope, placed her in the car, and drove onto the highway. Jeannette tried to memorize all the roads, despite being tied in a position that made it hard to observe. After driving for about an hour, the car stopped at a rest station near a bar. As they got out, he grabbed her hair. When Jeannette looked around and asked, "Where are we?" he replied, "I'm letting you go." While still holding her hair, he pulled it back and continued, "If you tell anyone what I did, who I am, or anything about me, I will come back for you, and I will kill your family and you." Jeannette, terrified, nodded, and the criminal let her out of the car and disappeared. Clearly, the original plan was to kill Jeannette. But why did he let her live? The broadcasts and flyers had resonated throughout the city, and he gradually felt the psychological pressure that someone might be watching him everywhere. That was the reason he dared not kill Jeannette and instead released her. When the kidnapper left, Jeannette summoned all her strength and ran into the store. The people inside immediately recognized her as the barefoot girl rushing in, the same little girl from the TV. "Are you the girl from the TV?" The man at the counter quickly handed Jeannette the phone. The police were dispatched to Jeannette's location immediately, and among them was Detective Heather. The criminal detective in charge of the case, Heather, hurriedly asked Jeannette questions as she climbed into the police car with legs that could barely move. The police reassured, "We will catch the perpetrator. Let's go to the hospital." But Jeannette insisted that the perpetrator must be caught. Heather decided on the spot to deploy the elite SWAT team to raid the kidnapper's house, based on the accurate house layout Jeannette sketched while sitting in the moving police car. Acting on the sketch, the police stormed the house and arrested the perpetrator hiding in the attic. Who was he? The criminal, Alvarez, was an average middle-aged man with no prior convictions. He denied all criminal actions at the time of arrest. With a defiant attitude, he said, "Find evidence, you won't find any." However, when the police presented the evidence Jeannette had hidden under the bed, the kidnapper was shocked, believing he had covered his tracks meticulously. In the end, he was silenced. The investigation proceeded smoothly, and Alvarez confessed to all charges, with ample evidence against him. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The perpetrator was caught, but Jeannette's pain remained. Even after medical examination, doctors revealed she could no longer bear children. For 6 years, until she was 15, Jeannette feared leaving her house and couldn't even go to school. Detective Heather, the investigating officer, became her source of courage. Heather visited Jeannette whenever she could, watching CSI detectives together, laughing, and spending time with Jeannette. Did Heather's actions have an effect? The answer is yes. Surprisingly, Jeannette has now become a police officer, working hard to protect the youth of Harlem, those at risk of becoming victims. Jeannette, a symbol of strength, intelligence, and especially courage from a young age, was able to save herself at the last moment and even ensure her attacker was brought to justice. One wonders, are there many more out there who can remain as calm and strong as she did?